Hi, everybody. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11B live lesson for today. Now, today we're going over the literary elements in postmodernism, and this is a bit of a long lesson, so please get your water, buckle up, get ready. It's going to take a little while for us to get through this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Move myself into the corner here. Okay, and we're going to go to slide number 5 and just jump right in. So we start off with slide 5, which is understanding postmodernism. So we've already gone over some of modernism happening basically right after World War II and Americans responding to how that war affected life in America. Postmodernism is the phase of time after that. So this is the phase of time that's after the Great Depression. Basically, because of all of the resources and technology that was pushed forward during World War II, there were a lot of new different types of opportunities and jobs that people could have when soldiers came back. And also, there were just more resources, more things were being reproduced because of the technology. So the United States was a bit richer than it was before during the Great Depression. So by comparison, there was a lot more wealth going around in certain communities. So Americans had more money to spend. There was also advertising started coming up and being more popular, and information sharing through communicative technology. So it's during this period at the start of the 1950s, basically, people started buying things, buying more things, owning more things. The television was invented, so that's how a lot of information was being communicated. And how advertising became as big a thing, and people began moving to the suburbs. Shopping malls became a thing because people were buying more things. So they had the idea to put stores all together in one location so that if people wanted to buy a lot of things at once, they wouldn't have to drive far or travel far to get, from store to store. And then here, we get a little, oh, actually, you know what? Let me go back and define a couple things for you. So there are a couple terms in this paragraph. There's mass consumerism here, and there's conspicuous consumption. Now, they don't actually explain these in the lesson, so I want to go over those with you. I almost forgot. So mass consumerism is basically just collecting items just to have them instead of for a reason. So normally when people bought things, like pre World War II, there wasn't as much emphasis on owning things to like look cool or be cool or for, or even just collecting things just to have things. So mass consumerism just has to do with buying things just to like have them, to enjoy things leisurely instead of everything having a purpose. And conspicuous consumption is when you buy things specifically to display your wealth. So special luxury types of clothing, types of shoes. Before, people had nice things because they wanted to not necessarily just display wealth, but they needed those things to show off at certain levels of like class. So for example, in the Victorian age, if you were getting ready to court suitors to figure out who you were going to marry, you were expected to have a dress that would work really well for showing that that was the purpose of you being there at the event, to like emphasize you looking beautiful. Now that dress would serve that purpose, but it would also more than likely be reused on your wedding day, and even further back in time, during the 1600s and the 1700s, when people had dresses, even the 1800s, people would have wedding dresses be constructed so that they could also be altered after you got married to also be the dress that you were buried in when you died. So there was a lot of thought into the purpose that different types of clothes served. So people would have dresses made to show that their wealth, but they also served a purpose. The idea of just, I don't know what I'm gonna wear this to, but I want it anyway because it looks pretty, is something that started happening around this time, postmodernism in the 1950s with conspicuous consumption. I don't have any reason to own this, but if other people see it, you know, that I have Gucci, other fashion items, these boots, these hair pins, this jacket, these vintage toys that I have a collection of, just to show like, oh, I have the money to spend on this. That's conspicuous consumption. And they do touch here on Americans relocating to the suburbs. But there's some, you know, racial connotations with that and economic connotations as well in terms of who was left to live in the city. So try to keep that in mind. Now on this slide, slide 6, we talk about the Cold War and the economic and technological development. So economic has to do with how money flows in a country, and technological development has to do with the different types of science and technology that push forward during the time. Being able to seek out more innovation with nuclear weapons led to an arms race between Russia, or known as the Soviet Union at that time, and the United States. So basically, after World War II, America decided that they were going to push forward to sort of be a global leader. They had decided to step up and represent how the world should be, which was supposed to contrast how different nations had like behaved and what their policies were during World War II. But this continued after World War II was over. And we know about and went over the nuclear technology that was unleashed during World War II in the last lesson. But even though the Soviet Union lost World War II to the US, they were still competing in terms of technology because they wanted to oppose America having potentially a stronghold over world economy and things like that. So there are two different races that the Soviet Union and the United States were a part of due to this. Now, one of them is the nuclear arms race, which I just mentioned, and the other one is the space race. So the nuclear arms race, of course, was basically a struggle for power. Whoever had the most nuclear weapons had the most threatening power. And both nations stockpiled thousands of nuclear weapons, it says here, enough to destroy the planet many times over. And that's true. There were and have been some treatises about people not using those weapons, but at the time when they were being made, there was a lot of paranoia in the US about whether or not World War III would just pop off at any moment. So if you've ever seen any movies, videos, TV shows, books that talk about World War III, that was inspired from this era of time because people were really worried about it. If the US and the Soviet Union all have nuclear weapons, what's to stop them from using them? They could just decide at any time and we would never know, is what the American public thought at the time. So far as the space race, the Soviet Union wanted to be able to prove that they could travel to space first, partially just to show the power of their technology and what they could achieve as a nation, and partially just in case there were any discoveries to be made, they wanted to beat the US to getting there. But also a lot of the innovation and technology that is researched by space stations gets recycled. It gets used by a lot of the smaller technologies that we use today. Like some of the upgrades that we've had to computers or cell phones came from technology that people discovered and worked on during the space race. All right, so that's basically the background of the time and how people were feeling. Don't forget that even though the nuclear race and space race were a thing, the most important backdrop to this was just kind of a lot of abundant wealth and a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen. Those are the two postmodern American like backdrop in terms of feelings that pop up. And they go into a little more of these things at this list here. It says, as noted, postmodern literature developed against the backdrop of abundant wealth, innovative technological advancement, and the fear of nuclear war. So that's it right there. That's basically the summary of the background right there. And then they give you a list of thematic elements that you can find in postmodern literature. So thematic has to do with themes, as we know. And elements means pieces of. So they're telling you, here's some things that you're going to find in postmodern literature, or things that point to postmodern influence on literature. So we have a resistance, that means fighting back, to a grand or meta narratives. So grand is like, you know, big, and meta is basically meta narratives are stories about life itself. So basically they pushed back against anything that could be considered an explanation for how life is or is supposed to be. And then here we have such as religion or nationalism that tend to define humanity and society. So they push back on the idea of there being bigger powers or bigger purposes to life and how things function in general. And then the second thing here is an uneasiness about the effects of modern capitalism on society and the individual. So there were a lot of people who just didn't know how to react to this new consumerist society, people buying things, people marketing frivolous things instead of just tools that people need to live and survive. The idea of just being able to buy things just to enjoy stuff and not to actually do anything made people feel uneasy because, you know, you're stockpiling all this material stuff. You only use these things sometimes. People were just unsure about how that would influence humans in the US to function in the future. And then it says, postmodernist writers push literature's traditions and limits with these types of features. So they gave you a list of the backdrop of what you can find in postmodern literature. And now they're saying, here's a list of things that pushed against or resisted traditions and limits. So here's the ways that they did the opposite of what was expected for them to be done at the time. Here's how they push back against traditional writing. So it says here, playfulness with language, including an emphasis on parody, irony, and satire. So just as a quick reminder, parody is when you imitate something that's well-known or famous to make fun of it or to produce a funny version of it. Irony has to do with the opposite of what you intend happening. So if you say one thing and you mean the opposite, most people mix that up with sarcasm because sarcasm uses irony. Or if the outcome of a story is the opposite of what you think would happen based on the events, that's situational irony. Satire here is basically using irony and sarcasm to make fun of or criticize a structure or person or process, the way that people do things. So they use these things and that wasn't super typical at the time. People used to use these sparingly to make a point, but basically in postmodern literature, people started using this a lot. The same way that we use a lot of sarcasm when we talk these days, in terms of like, think of, you know, performance and the types of jokes people make in YouTube videos and TikTok videos, on Twitch. There's a lot of irony, there's a lot of parody and satire. People used to do these things traditionally back in the day, but it wasn't as often. you would have maybe a, a handful of authors use parody to make a point or use satire to make a point. They were much more straight to the point if they were criticizing something traditionally. So this is just the age where um, sarcasm, satire, and irony became like the language that people used normally. The second one we have here is chronological time frame. Now, some of this was in modernist literature. When we were looking at some of the writing excerpts from people who dealt with World War II and showing how those affected people, they didn't write things in sequence. And postmodernism carries that tradition on. So not everything that they show you in a story happens in the same order that it happened in. They show you the story in the order that will push you to feel the most about what's going on. They start using time skips as a way to show twists and turns in the story. I mean, look at the amount of times that you can find a Netflix show or even just a CW show or a network show that does flashbacks, that goes back in time to show you something that happened right before you see the result of what happened such a long time ago, instead of just going all the way back to the beginning and building up from there. They try to show you the things that are important instead of focusing on giving you an entire timeline, because there might be some parts in the timeline that aren't important. And then this last one is the emphasis on self-reflexivity. And then they give you the definition of that afterwards. So listen up in case you're not sure what that means. Just to break this word down, self obviously means you yourself, right? Turning something back on you. And reflexivity is the actual word for that turning back. So like yourself is you, obviously. Reflexivity means to look back on yourself. So in this case, self-reflexivity in writing is when the writer writes about the writing process. So it says here, the writer turning the narrative lens here meaning point of view. So the narrative point of view, that means the point of view of the story, back on the writing process. So you're writing about what it's like to write something. And then it says it allows the writer to reflect on the process of creating art. So there's a lot of people writing about either how difficult it is to write, what the purpose of writing is, what they hope to achieve with their writing, perhaps comparing their writing to other people who write, and what the differences between their work are. Again, this is a thing that sometimes happened in traditional writing, but it didn't really happen a lot. In postmodernism, we got a lot more people looking a lot more closely at what becomes popular, what people identify with, and why. And it became a little more important for readers to understand what the point of the piece was and what the author hopes the readers will get out of reading the piece. So there's a lot more, basically, I guess what we would call like in 2021 or 2022, meta commentary. You would basically get that in the book. You would get maybe a book about someone writing a book, and you would get insight on the sort of things that maybe the author is thinking about putting into the book based on their experiences, that kind of thing. Sometimes you would get authors who are criticizing other authors by talking about the writing process and what they think this other author does or doesn't do or understands or doesn't understand about the writing process. Okay, now we get a third list. It says postmodernist literature also explores non-traditional literary forms. So it's not just the stuff in the book that's different. They also changed the way that they organized the books that they wrote. So there was greater experimentation with the form of a novel, story, or poem. And that kind of goes into the things happening out of order. There was less reliance on traditional narrative form and character development. So instead of like a classical hero's journey, people kind of did spin-offs and tried to like change what you would expect to happen in a story from this point in time to sort of give you a bit of an extra twist. more experimentation with the point of view and passage of time. So that's just who's telling the story and how quickly is it happening. If you're messing around with what order a story happens in, then this kind of happens naturally. You tend to slow down when you're looking at the past, and you tend to speed up things when you're looking at the future. So figuring out how much of each to put in a book is changing the way that people usually think about books. And then the next part is a mixture of high art and popular culture within a single text. So that's just acknowledging that wording can be artful, making references to pop culture and expecting people to understand what you are talking about within the text. There were references to well-known books in classical types of literature, but those references were being made because educated people were expected to know them. At this point, popular culture is just, well, this is very popular, so I'm expecting you to recognize it, as opposed to it being for an educational purpose or something like that. It's similar to how people expect others to know certain types of memes these days. So not every meme actually has a point. Some of them are just funny or stupid just to carry a joke. So there's a difference between like everyone recognizing, I don't know, like one of the common memes that pops up, like the Pikachu face, and everyone knowing what reading rainbow is, something like that. Like there's definitely a point to knowing the cultural significance of reading rainbow in people's lives in terms of helping people learn how to read. It had a Black host. It was on PBS for a long time, which is like an educational channel. So a lot of children grew up with that, not just from the perspective of watching TV just to watch, but to actually learn about stuff. And the Pikachu surprise face is just like a funny screen grab that somebody drew over that people think is funny. So that's the difference between classical allusion, which is reference to things that people are expected to know, and pop culture references. Usually pop culture references are used for jokes, and allusion or reference to older texts in classical literature was done to evoke some higher train of thought or philosophy. And then here, the last one is an interest in metafiction, in which the characters are aware that they are just characters within a larger universe. Now, we don't have that happen a whole lot in shows these days, but usually in a television show, especially if it's running for a long time, something like Supernatural, or if you're going old school, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and things like that, usually you'll, like for shows that have run for a very long time, you'll have like a joke episode where the characters happen to be in a musical or in an episode where they know that they're characters, there's some sort of like illusion or dream happening and they're aware of that. And also, I think what happens more often, like what's more common, is characters knowing they're in a larger universe. They don't always know that they are characters, but knowing that you're in a larger universe that relates to things like the MCU, or pretty much any piece of fiction that has to do with like a book or a movie where there's a multiverse or something like that. An example of metafiction would be, for example, like The Matrix. Most people have heard of that. The people who are in the Matrix who break out become aware that they are in a world that's been taken over by machines. So there's a greater world outside of the one that they perceive, like while they're, resting in the machines being alive. And they have to deal with the information of knowing that they are kind of just characters that are running around in a universe that doesn't work the way that they think it does. There are a lot of comic books where characters have to confront the person who's writing them. Deadpool is very famous for that. And there are also like YouTube animations and things where like characters interact with their artists and stuff like that. So that was definitely not common at all in traditional writing. You very rarely see anything like that in traditional writing. So postmodernist literature explored that a lot more. And this is a thing that is very specific to postmodern literature and not in modern literature. A lot of these, I would say these top three especially, you could associate with just modern literature from our last lesson, but these last two are definitely postmodern, post-World War II, post the United States economy bouncing back from the Great Depression. Now here on this slide, they give you an example of this happening in this excerpt from Lost in the Funhouse. I'm not going to go through the whole thing and read it for this lesson, but you should take your time while you are going through the lesson to actually pause and read this. You can do it now, but the bottom basically just explains that this is an excerpt where a person gives you an analysis or feedback on literary technique. So that's an example of that self-reflexivity we were talking about. So there's information in here about how decisions are made when people are writing things. So that's self-reflexive. The self in this case is the work itself. The people in the text are talking about what it's like to write text. Let's see. Oh, wait, back. Alrighty. So they give you a list of novels that were famous during the postmodernist era. So I'm gonna try to go through these as quickly as I can, but make sure that you take time to read these. I'm gonna try to hit the major points though. So the first one is White Noise. It's by Don DeLillo. And it basically just portrays the fear of death that humans have, especially after seeing the devastation that can happen from atomic and nuclear devices, and the harmful effects of technology. So they basically tells this story through a character named Jack Gladney and his wife Babette. And this is one of the more satirical types of stories. The Mezzanine is the second one. It's by Nicholson Baker. The Musing of a Man as he takes an escalator to his office after buying shoelaces. Now, the important things about this story is that it's pretty mundane. So it's basically just giving you information about this person's everyday life, but it's all described as though it's very important. And that's a technique called maximalism. So you take small things and blow it up. Minimalism is when you take big things and scale them down so that they're simple. Maximalism is making a big deal out of small things. So every small thing they have here, like milk cartons, shoelaces, and deodorant, things that people encounter and use every day, are explained as like really big, important things with a lot of detail, so much description. They describe it like it's holy or divine. And it's supposed to give you more information about how, or give you the impression of how important these things are that we take for granted by blowing them up this way. The next one is Infinite Jest. It's a lengthy work, so they're saying that it's longer. Infinite Jest is by David Foster Wallace. And it takes place in a future where the United States has merged with Canada and Mexico. So North America is all one continent, or I guess like one country combined on the continent. But New England, so that's the east coast of the US, has become a toxic waste dump. And this was inspired by the waste that started piling up due to consumerism and people working in factories and manufacturing. You have to also remember these are the times where cars began to be manufactured in factories and becoming bigger and bulkier and fancier, using gas and everything. So just a lot of things about the American life changed during this time period. So a lot of these books reflect those kind of things. Now it says that this story uses extreme irony. So lots of things that don't match up are happening all the time, and satire. So it's a lot of commentary and criticism on consumerism and how that's going to affect the US population. And this book also includes references to like drug addiction, and just people not knowing how to react to the new wealth that the US has after the war. The next one is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Now this is a little difficult to explain, so I'm going to try to break it down as easily as I can. So it's supposed to be the story of a bombardier. That is a person who checks for the presence of bombs on a field during war, and a person who flies a plane to drop bombs themselves. That's what a bombardier is. And the title, Catch-22, we know that a Catch-22 is something that happens in a cycle. So it's more of the chicken or the egg thing. You're not sure where the cycle starts, but it's kind of a toxic cycle that no one can really break. We don't know what came first, or if the cause is the result, or if the result is the cause. Now, the reason why it's called this and why Catch-22 grew to have this meaning is because of this book. So the title, Catch-22, is supposed to refer to a rule that basically any man that flies a bomber has to be crazy, because you're flying a plane to drop bombs, you're looking for bombs. There's like a high likelihood that when you do this, you won't come back. But so basically the people who want to do this, people who volunteer to do this, clearly have to be crazy. But it's a delicate job, and there's a lot of pressure. If you don't find bombs for your fellow soldiers, you may actually cause the deaths of people in your platoon. So some people try to avoid the bombardier assignment because they think that they're not sound enough of mind. They think that they're too crazy to do the job correctly. However, most people who think that they might be crazy are usually not crazy. That's kind of a rule of psychology. So the idea is, if you think you're too crazy to do this job, then that means that you actually have to be sane, because you realize the danger of it and what it takes to actually do it. So if you don't want to do the job, that's going to make them, the army, want you to do this job more. If you're worried about whether or not you can do this job right, then clearly you have a good head on your shoulders. But if you accept the assignment, then you have to be crazy to accept the assignment. That's generally the rule. So any man that refuses is forced to fly more missions. So there's sort of the question, do you fly more missions because you're crazy? Or are you crazy because you've flown a lot of these missions? Especially because doing this back to back to back to back with the fate of so many people on your shoulders is a lot of pressure for a single person in a plane taking up the bombardier position. So that's the cycle. Any man that refuses to do the bombardier job is clearly sane enough to know how much pressure there is, and they have to fly more missions. But if they fly more missions, then they want to fly those missions even less because they know how dangerous it is. So are you more sane because you're doing these missions and you realize how dangerous it is, or are you more crazy because you're doing them over and over again anyway? It's a chicken or the egg kind of thing. Does the assignment make you crazy, or are you crazy before you take on the assignment, sort of thing? The next one is The Crying Lot of 49 by Thomas Pynchon. So this is a short story, which basically gives you the story of a character who finds out about a conspiracy between mail carrying companies. And he discovers basically a bunch of old letters that lets him know about this issue that these two companies were having with each other. And it basically uses the postmodernist characteristics, so like the time jumping and the satire. They criticize companies in general during this novel, but that's basically what makes it postmodernist. It uses a lot of those tropes. And then the last one that we have here is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Now, if you've been a student with us for a little while, in this class or in English 11, A or B, you might have heard of Kurt Vonnegut before. He's a pretty famous author, but this is one of his most famous stories. Basically, it focuses on the bombing of Dresden in World War II. And the main character is basically held prisoner in the city of Dresden. And pretty much it features a lot of the writing that we saw from the last lesson from modernism. I believe that Kurt Vonnegut was actually directly mentioned in that lesson too. So it has a lot of self-reflexivity as a person, the main character writing about his experience of being held prisoner. There's lots of satire, and the events of Billy Pilgrim's life are not told in any specific order that makes sense. So there's a lot of molding and melding, mixing of modernist and postmodernist stuff from Kurt Vonnegut and Slaughterhouse-Five. Alrighty. So finally, we get to the reading sections. So basically, the whole point of the first half of this lesson is to just give you background information on the types of writing that people were putting out at the time and what postmodernist literature looks like before you got to the reading sections. So here we're going to have a few reading sections from authors and some explanations too from their texts. At this point, we're getting to English writing being very similar to what you would expect to read today. So there's not as much weird sentence structure or older words that you're less likely to understand. So a lot of the examples that we've got here are short, but there are more of them because they're expecting you as a student to be able to understand a bit more than in some of the other previous classes where you looked at older things. So I believe we have 2 or 3 different excerpts this time. So this first one is Loneliness, an American Malady. And this is by Carson McCullers. We have her pictured here on the right. And they give you some background of her as a person. She wrote a whole lot about themes of loneliness and isolation. She had a difficult life, and that is what she used for the inspiration of her work. She was a pianist, but she developed rheumatic fever. Basically, she just wasn't able to play piano anymore after a certain point. And she studied at school for creative writing. And her first novel is The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and she published that at age 22. I'm going to give you some more information about her personal life since her work has to do with loneliness. She married, divorced, and then remarried the same person. But she pretty much felt lonely her whole life and died in 1967 after a series of strokes. So she was just a very sickly person with a lot of complications to her life. So Loneliness, an American Malady is an essay that she wrote, which is supposed to be about the feelings of isolation that the American public feel and why. She had this essay and a bunch of other writings in The Mortgage Heart. I'm reading this aloud to you because when they give you information about other works that an author has done, you definitely need to put those in your notes. They're telling you these not just to give you background information, but because they may pop up on the mastery test. And more importantly, they may pop up on the final. They want you to be able to look at your notes and at least try to recognize some of these names. Now, they tell you when you're reading this to pay attention to the central ideas and literary elements. Consider reading strategies on the next screen as you read your essay. So we're going to go over those. So considering context. So basically, they're just explaining all of the reasons why background information is important. So if you've noticed, and I mean, you should have at this point because you're taking 11th grade English, there's always 2 parts to these lessons. You get a little bit of a history overview or a history lesson about the time period that these works takes place in, and sometimes major events that happen during the time that the things you're reading are written. And the reason why that's important is because these things happening influence the people who are writing the pieces. It says here, modernist literature, for example, was a reaction after World War I. After the war, many writers turned to non-traditional literary forms and themes of disillusionment. Examining that period in US history can help readers understand connections between the war and modernist literature. So basically, knowing the time, knowing what happened is what's important to help you understand the background and things that might pop up and show up. So modernist literature was a reaction to World War I. Postmodernism was a reaction to World War II. So you can, or life after World War II. So you're able to definitely tell the difference between those two things and how they affected what people wrote. After World War I, people were just devastated by the number of lives that had to be lost during the war because of technology and people becoming more efficient at killing things, and the sheer number of people who didn't come back from that war just gutted the US morale. After World War II, there's a little more focus not on the cost of war in terms of people, but American life being spoiled by all of the consumerism and collecting items. So people were more reflecting on what life was like after the war in a way that relates to your everyday person, as opposed to modernist literature, which was just a reaction to the war and the sacrifices people had to make in it, and how just what is the point of war is what people wanted to ask after World War I. So during the postmodern period, it says here, some writers have held critical perspectives towards the advancements that were made at this time. Considering and researching a work's historical context can help you predict how the subject of information and technology will be treated. So basically, if you understand how people at that time felt about certain things like technology, money, consumerism, stuff like that we've been going over, then you have a better idea of knowing what you might see in a work that you read. So for example, they give you F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender in the Night. It explores a tumultuous romance between a married couple, Dick and Nicole. Fitzgerald modeled the mentally unstable Nicole after his own wife, Zelda. So what that tells you is that if you do research on how his life went with his wife, Zelda, you'll have a little more insight as to how she wrote this character of Nicole and what similarities they would have. So it says here at the bottom, understanding context can also help you make better predictions about the characters in the text. Absolutely. So if you know what the attitude towards writing is at the time, then you can predict what might pop up. If we're reading a text from back in the 1600s, in the 1700s, when the American colonists were coming over and settling the land, there were a lot of works that were religious based because a lot of the people that moved over here were religious. There were a lot of works that had to specifically do with being optimistic about settling the land and about finding resources, a lot about logical arguments for why the colonies shouldn't have to be under the thumb of Britain, because those were big things at the time. People were being taxed unfairly. People were in the new age of enlightenment, people were writing basically scholarly debates about why they thought people should be treated the way that they are treated, and trying to make those points via stories and pamphlets. Now, if you don't do any of that research to understand that that was what was going on at the time, you might pick up a poem that's that old and ask yourself, like, why are they writing like this? Why is there God referenced in some texts, but they talk about the importance of logic in others? Like, I don't understand. Context is super important, and that's why they always give you information in these slides, specifically about the background of the story before you read it. Okay, so now we're moving on to the analysis of McCullough's essay. Let's see. So basically, they let you know, and I'm letting you know again, just as a reminder, I usually don't read excerpts. The excerpts will be read and uploaded in separate videos. But the reason why I go over the analysis is because sometimes it's important for you to hear what you're going to encounter in the excerpt before you read it. If you know what's in it, especially if this is something you haven't studied before, this is your first time in an English 11 class, you don't have any English credits from another school where someone taught you in a building, it's easier to have an idea of what to look for in the literature that you're reading before you get around to reading it. So they tell you that thematically, that means as a theme, as an ongoing idea that people are supposed to relate to. There's an uncertain and apprehensive. Apprehensive means kind of like nervous, begrudging, like you're hesitating a little bit, you're a little worried. Critique of American society. So she's uncertain about how American society is developing with the way that people are buying so many things, wasting so many things, valuing just having things instead of being able to do things. It says here also that she mixes scientific and philosophical thought. So she mixes things that are logical and factual with basically thoughts about the soul and the internal workings of people. And then it also says that she uses an unorthodox, that means out of the ordinary, fragmented, that means broken into pieces format, and blends literary styles and forms, including the use of second person and third person point of view within a reflective essay. So because this is an essay, she's switching between second person, that's you and your, and third person, which is he, she, they. And then they give you an excerpt. Consciousness of self is the first abstract problem that the human being solves. So abstract means like big picture stuff, hard to grasp in like a concrete form. So like you're self-conscious, for example, you can't really describe that as a physical thing. It's something that's an idea that people understand because we all have a subconscious. So yeah, it's the first problem that human beings solve. Indeed, it is this self-consciousness that removes us from lower animals. So that's what elevates us as humans, is what she's saying. This primitive grasp of identity develops with constantly shifting emphasis through all of our years. Perhaps maturity is simply the history of those mutations that reveal to the individual the relation between himself and the world in which he finds himself. So they start off scientific, talking about humans and how we think of ourselves, the fact that self-consciousness exists. We know this through science and study. We all have a self-consciousness. But then she starts talking about what the concept of maturity might be. So the idea of maturity might be how we change in ourselves over the years, and the difference between how we feel in our heads and what the world is like. So that's when we start moving into philosophy. We're trying to define things that are more concept than like something that we can look at and examine. And then they go down, they give you the summary in the last paragraph here. McCullough suggests that the loneliness Americans feel is a malady without any cure. The root of this malady can be traced to a search for identity. And then it says the essay focuses on the theme of uncertainty and the yearning for meaning in post-war society. So basically questioning how people process the search for identity and vent that through the things they do and what they consume. Okay, so our second piece for this lesson is The Brown Chest by John Updike. So they give you some information about John Updike, the author. So he was born on a farm in Pennsylvania, and he studied for a year in England. He worked for the New Yorker, and he published some of his poems and stories. And also he was a literary critic. So he read other people's things and gave them feedback and wrote articles about his feedback for other people to read. He's pretty famous for two novels, which is Rabbit is Rich and Rabbit at Rest. And they both won Pulitzer Prizes. But he also wrote other things. They give you the name of one of his other novels, The Witches of Eastwick, which was adapted into a movie. So then they describe his work includes a range. That means he does a lot of different kinds of narrative styles. Narrative styles is how you tell the story, like which characters you use to tell the story. Is it first person, second person, or third person, that kind of thing. And then it says that a lot of his stories show the special qualities of the ordinary. So that's that maximalism that we were talking about, taking the ordinary things and drawing attention to how important they are, even though we take them for granted a lot. It says others display the more experimental characteristics of postmodernism. So he did a lot of more traditional stories that just emphasize how important the ordinary are. And there are other works of his that have more of the format experimentation and things of postmodernism. And then it says, despite the wide assortment of literary characteristics in his texts, Updike preferred to set his stories in suburban America, which he intended to be a symbol of detachment from worldly distress. So basically, the cul-de-sacs and suburbs that people lived in were different than cities that were like pushed and squished close together. So he tried to use them as a symbol of detachment from all of the hustling and bustling of inner city stuff. Alrighty, so on this next slide, we are talking about motifs. So they give you the explanation of what a motif is. And it's basically when you repeat a picture or element or certain words or ideas in a text over and over. So some people could call them like extended metaphors, but once you repeat the same idea or image description over and over again, it becomes a motif because you're doing it on purpose. And it says that motifs can include a particular word, phrase, image, object, or even an action by a character. So basically anything that you make repeat in your story on purpose to carry meaning or symbolism becomes a motif. So it has to repeat throughout, that's through the whole story. So think of like, for example, if you're watching a television show where the hint that the big bad is coming is shown by how some mysterious rock in a cave is glowing. Maybe it's dim or not lit up at all when the characters first find it in the first episode. But as the season goes on, maybe it takes on a glow. Maybe certain runes carve into it and you can see symbols. That gives your brain a hint. Oh man, we keep seeing stuff happen with this. So clearly this represents something and we'll have to see what happens once the transformation of this item or whatever is complete. In some books, it's not just something, it's not something that obvious. Sometimes you'll have something like, for example, we'll go with a pretty famous example. For those of you who are familiar with Pokemon, the Pokemon Ho-Oh is used as a good luck symbol throughout the series. So there's two places where you see it, at the very beginning of the series and once in one of the movies. Now that bird Pokemon popping up on tablets and stuff in between in other episodes gives you a hint that it's important. It's a motif, it's supposed to represent something. And sometimes you don't know until the very end of the story or season that it represents something. Those things are motifs. Books also have motifs. Sometimes they're harder to catch if you're not looking for them, if you're just sort of, dragging your eyes across the page. But you can actually have a motif in a book that repeats over and over. Sometimes it's a phrase, maybe it's a prayer that a character says over and over that's supposed to represent comfort or their stability. Sometimes it's a word that shows up over and over. Maybe there's a phrase um, or an object. Maybe there's a charm that a character wears all the time, and that charm represents how aligned to the good side the character is. So if it cracks or gets lost, ooh, everybody better watch out. All of those things are motifs. So it's something that happens that you see over and over again in a book, story, movie, play, and it's supposed to give the readers or the watchers a hint as to something that is important. Um, Motifs get more significance um, than just putting emphasis on a mood, because they pop up over and over again, and your readers or your viewers will associate certain things with them since they pop up over and over. So it becomes a symbol, and eventually, if it repeats enough times, all the symbol or the motif has to do is show up, and that creates a connection between the readers or the watchers and the text. So you get to basically define what something is. So they give you an example here. There is a short story called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, and there are stones that are a motif that pop up. So every time the stones pop up and are mentioned in the story, they're supposed to represent the violent aspects of society, because people can throw rocks, you can beat people with a rock, that kind of thing. Every time they show up, it's bad. So by associating that object with bad things, whenever they are mentioned in the story, your brain is conditioned through the story to think of that as a bad omen. It becomes a symbol. Now, the reason why they're giving you this lesson now is because in the brown chest, the chest itself is a motif. It's mentioned several times. They tell you how important it is. And in the next couple slides, we'll talk about what's actually important about it. Again, I don't read excerpts in these lessons, but we're going to go over the analysis so that you know what to look for when you go back and read it yourself. Okay. So on slide 19 here, they start the analysis. Now the chest, like I said before, is a motif that gathers meaning through the story and becomes a major symbol because you see it so many times. Now the chest is a part of the main character's life from boyhood. So basically through the story, you get to see how it represents different types of things to him over the course of his life. When he's young, they have an excerpt here where basically he thinks about the chest, and it reminds him of death and decay, because it's a family heirloom that basically old dead people used to own, and that used to scare him as a kid. And pretty much it represents kind of like a coffin, and just reminds him of time passing, because it's being passed down from person to person in his family. But as he grows up, the chest begins to symbolize something different. So he ends up using the chest for different things. So the chest starts meaning different things to him, because it's not just some old scary thing that he had to deal with as a child. Basically, the chest has a lot of his old family history stuff in it. Lots of heirlooms, lots of information about his family and their achievements. And as he understands what these things are and why they are important, the chest becomes more meaningful to him. They give information about his family members, people that he'll never be able to meet because they're long gone. And John Updike gives some short stories about the significance of these things as told by the man's mother. And because it's connected to his family history, he ends up relating it or thinking of his family history and memories with his family when he's older. He also ends up, we get to see his story basically from a young boy to him being a man, and he has to pass this chest down to his son when his son is getting married. And he talks about how important the chest is going to be for his son and his son's son and his son's son's son down the line. So his the way that he thinks of this chest changes very drastically from something scary to something significant or important that he's passing to the next generation. But because this is a postmodernist piece, The time sequence of the events in this story are not in order. So basically, it skips around. We don't get to see the kid grow up just from a kid straight up to an adult. It sort of skips around as we get descriptions of things that are important. So the story is more so trying to explain to us how and why he discovers that the chess is important instead of focusing on the life of the man. Alrighty, and then this last section here is just the focus on language. Now, as per usual, if you're having issues with understanding these words, I would in fact try to copy down this first column that gives you the word and the part of speech and the definition. If you need the pronunciation key, I will write this down. Sometimes I have to write down the pronunciation of words just so I can remember it, because it's important to be able to see it over and over and correct yourself. That's pretty much how we learn. And I think that is about it. Yep, okay. Yep, so that's it for this lesson. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. Alrighty, so that was our lesson on postmodernism. If you're having issues with any of the excerpts and understanding them, I know that it's written in modern English, but just in case you need help, feel free to ask for a tutoring session with either myself or Ms. Kathy Vahovic. This lesson was not as long as I thought it was going to be. There's just a lot of background information in terms of the history of postmodernism. But that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're having issues, schedule a tutoring appointment. Take your time going through the excerpt. I always think it's important to read the analysis if you think you're going to have trouble with the excerpt, but you have to actually go back and read them. The thing is, the mastery test is going to ask you about understanding parts of the actual excerpts. They're not just going to ask you questions about the analysis so that you can skim it and just be able to knock out the questions. If you don't actually understand what ends up happening in the story, you're going to be lost. So even though I'm going through the analysis and explaining what you're going to find in the stories, you still actually need to go back and read those stories. If you're having issues with the excerpts, like I said, schedule a tutoring session. And I think that's about it for today. So, all right, this is Miss Amber signing off. And good luck with your English class.